Want to learn how to quickly and easily create complex animation in Unreal Engine without a single keyframe? That's good, because that's what I'm talking about for the next 20 minutes. Hey, Aharon Rabinowitz here for School of Motion. Recently, I made a tutorial showing you how to use the cloner system in Unreal Engine 5.4's brand spanking new motion design tools. In this video, we're going to look at Animators, a new set of tools which make it crazy easy to add slick-looking, repetitive, or random animation without having to keyframe anything. Before we jump into it, remember to like and subscribe and do all of that, and also download the project file so that you can follow along. Okay, let's get into it. So here we are in Unreal, and the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have the motion design tools turned on. So we go to Edit, go to Plugins, and from here, we'll just bring this over here, and you're going to search right here for motion design. And if it's already enabled, great. If it's not, hit the checkbox. You'll probably need to restart. And then once you're back, you'll see that there is a motion design button over here. Now I'm going to click on this motion design button, and it's going to change the interface quite a bit. And mostly it's what I need, but I want to just change it slightly to where I'm a little more comfortable, and I'm going to choose default viewport. And for perspective, I'm just going to choose the camera that I'm using here. Now, we're going to look at the animators, and the first animator is the simplest. It's called time, and it says that over time, an object should change its value from one value to the second value. And that could be a position, that could be rotation. So in this case, I'm going to select these blades for this fan, and I'm going to right click over here, and I'm going to choose time, and I'm going to choose rotation. And when I let go, it starts to spin all over the place. What's happening? Well, by the way, note that you may have switched over to the operator stack. If you need to get back to being able to pick out the objects, you go over to the outliner. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to choose my blades, and then I'm going to go back to the operator stack right here. And in the operator stack, I'm going to choose animators. And then once I'm in there, you can see the animator. By the way, I could just select this animator, hit delete, and that'll get rid of it. I'm just going to undo that though, so we still have it. And what we're going to look at is, why is this thing going crazy? Well, the properties are linked. So we have X, Y, and Z. Let's open this up a little bit. Let's unlink them, and then we can turn on relative rotation pitch, and that's actually the one that I want. Now, you may notice if you're in your object transform mode and not the world transform mode, you may see that what's happening is it's not actually going a full 360 degrees. It's snapping back after about 90-degree rotation. And we can see this if we twirl down this property right here, we can see it's actually set to go from -90 to 90. So I'm going to set this to 0, and I'm going to set this value to 360. And over time, you can see that that's actually going to rotate the full 360 degrees. And to slow it down, we can just change the frequency down to say 0.1. And that goes much slower. Now, if we take a look in the interface, we can see a whole bunch of properties. I've already covered a couple of them. There's something here called time offset. So let's say it was rotating and you didn't want it to start at 0 degrees. You could offset the time this way. But I'm going to leave most of this alone. The one right here for mode, absolute versus additive, basically if you're rotated 90 degrees and you want it to rotate, this will add, at absolute it'll start at 0, and at additive it will add to the current value of 90 degrees. There's also an option down here to use the time source instead of the world's time, is to use the sequences. And we're going to look at that a little bit later. Something else here is the animator's magnitude. That's for everything. But we also have a magnitude right here, which we can lower the magnitude, which might seem to be like, what's the difference between that and say the lowering the frequency? Well, what we're doing actually is lowering the strength of it over time. So we can animate this again in the sequencer, and then we can have it settle at 0, for example. And we'll look at that again a little bit later. By the way, if you ever want to disable an animator, just come up here and uncheck either the specific animator, or if you've got more than one, you can select this and it will temporarily deactivate all of them. Now let's look at another example. We'll look at something called the wiggle animator. So I have this dial selected, and I'm going to right click again on rotation here, and I'm going to choose wiggle, and I'm just going to choose rotation. And again, I'm just going to let go, and it's going to be wiggling all over the place. But we know that if we grab hold of this and we go into the animators here, we can change the linked properties to unlinked, and then we can work with this one. And you can see that what's happening is it's wiggling between two values. Just twirl this down, and we can see that it's wiggling between -90 and 90. If you wanted to go more or less, you could. But we can also set the frequency up to something more frequent, like 5, and that's going to go crazy there. Or you can set it down to 0.5 and it'll be a little slower, which is nice. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. In this case, I want it to go, let's say, maybe just 50 degrees and 50 degrees. So negative 50 and 50. And then I want it to be very frequent. So let's set it to like 2. And if you wanted to just show something that was like even going to, let's say, blow its top right here. Let's say this was a temperature thing, or this was air pressure or something like that. Let's say to negative 90 actually. And we'll set this to negative 80. And we'll set the frequency to 20. And then you got that. Now let's look at an animator called Oscillate. So I'm just going to right click over here and I'm going to choose Oscillate and I'm going to choose Location. And then we let go and we can see that it's kind of running all over the place. You know, it's going left and right, but it's really going on a diagonal. And again, it's just because of the properties being linked. So I'm going to disconnect all of these and let's see if we can figure out. So it's this one that I want, right? I want this one to go up and down, and oscillating is just going back and forth, repeating the pattern over and over again. And you can choose different kinds of functions. You can choose a sine, cosine, there's a triangle or sawtooth, right? So there's different ways of using this. And again, you just twirl down in here and you change the values for magnitude, right? The amplitude minimum is, so it's going up negative 100 units, right? So I can set this to negative 50 and I can set this one to 50. And then it's moving back and forth. And again, I can just come back here and change this from sawtooth. I can go back to sine and it's moving back and forth like that. And you can actually create some complex animation if you stack animators together on one object, or if you have multiple objects that are connected and you give each of them animators. So in this example, I've got this turret and its pieces are connected. We've got the guns, we've got the pivot point right here, and then we've got the base. So I'll start with the guns. I'll just right click on rotation. I'll choose oscillate and I will choose rotation. And here's a little tip. If that whole thing where it flies all over the place and starts animating drives you nuts, you can, before you let go of the interface, you can just click on that, linked properties, and it won't start doing that. Again, if I had left it on, it's all over the place. But let's just come over to here. We'll use the bottom one here, relative rotation roll. And we're just going to twirl into the roll settings here. And I'm going to set this to, I want to go with negative 20 and 20. So now it's moving up and down. That speed feels a little fast. So let's go to 0.2. So now we've got something that looks a little more mechanical, going up and down. And then I'm going to select the pivot point right here. And again, do the same thing. We'll choose oscillate and then rotation. And then we'll just unlink everything here. And we'll use this middle one for yaw. And we'll just slow that down because that's crazy. We'll set the frequency down to 0.1. And so now what you have is two different parts of this are being animated over time, and it's continuous, it looks fluid, and it looks really interesting, and no keyframes had to be added. Another way you can use Oscillate is to use it as a camera controller. So I can have the camera rotate around this object if I wanted to. So what I'll do is, first I'm going to create an actor. So we'll just kind of go over here and we'll choose basic and we'll choose actor. And I'm just going to set that we'll zero it out, and then I'll just bring it up to right about here. And so basically now it's sitting in the center of the project, and I'm going to make the camera a child of this actor. And once I've done that, I can select the actor and I could choose oscillate, rotation right here, jump into it. And what we'll do is we'll just come down and unlink the properties. And let's just try going to relative yaw. And of course, we can slow this down. We can play with a couple of different things. Let's go instead of sine, we can go with cosine or square even. Let's go with cosine here. And let's slow things down. Let's just go to the global frequency and set this to 0.2. And you can see that we can rotate around the object. So you can basically use this to automate animation going back and forth and moving the camera around. The animators are super useful in so many ways. The next animator I want to look at is called the Pulse Animator. And at first it might seem a lot like Oscillate, but let me show you how it works and you'll see it's actually quite different. So let's start with the position here. So let's just right click and choose Pulse, and then we'll go to Location. And if we let go, we'll see that it's flying in what seems to be the same kind of behavior that the oscillation was doing. So let's get down there a little bit and work with this stuff. So I'm going to turn off all of these. And then we'll start with the location Y, so it's going left to right. And then let's head back up here and take a look at some of the easing functions, which we saw before. There were a few, but these have very different ones. So for example, there's something here called Expo, which I really like. It kind of holds it. It exponentially gets into the end of it, holds it, and then pulls out again. So that's pretty cool. You also have the ability to choose easing type for in, out, and in and out. So basically, like, you can have it easing in and out right now, the way it's doing, or you can have it only easing one way and not the other. So let's see if we go with in here. All right, you can see how that looks. And of course, we can come down here and maybe just lower the frequency a little bit. Why don't we say 0.75, just a little bit slower. And let's take a look at some of the other ones, right? So let me just go back to in, out. And let's take a look. We've got back, which I think is pretty cool. That one's a real, it just kind of really holds it there. And then there's one called elastic and one called bounce. And I can think of a couple of uses of these. Maybe we'll look at some. But it's also worth noting that pulse can be useful for something like scale. So if I just come over here and I choose scale, so we'll choose pulse and we'll go with scale. And we'll let that go for a moment. It gets bigger and smaller. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. And then what I'll do is just come into the properties here, and we can unlink them, and then you get some weird stuff, right, where it's kind of like not sure what it's doing. So we'll come back to that in a second. Let's do this. Let's go with, instead of linear, let's go with Expo, which I really like. And then we're going to jump into each of these properties. And why don't I set, like, for example, the amplitude minimum to 0.5, and that's for X. For Y, I'll set it to amplitude minimum of 0.3, but I'm also going to change the frequency to 0.5. And then for the last one, I'm just going to go relative Z right here, and we're going to change the amplitude minimum to 0.75 and the frequency to 0.2. So now we're getting all sorts of weird kind of motion that's, again, it's repetitive and it looks complex, but as you can see, it's actually just 3 different speeds of the same kind of animation for different properties of it. And you start to play with these long enough, and you can see that there is a lot of application with even those weird ones like bounce or elastic. And the animators are really great with text too. Let me show you a couple examples of that. And what I'm going to do is grab hold of this text layer right here that's neon glow. And just so you can see, there's 2 layers. There's a layer of glow, and it's sitting right on top of this neon layer that's not glowing, right? So I have the 2 together here like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click over here, and I'm going to choose wiggle. And this time, instead of choosing one of the properties like this, you can see there's a whole bunch of new things here, like text character location, rotation, scale, and visibility. I'm going to choose text character visibility. And when I let go, what we'll see is per character, it's randomly letting it blink, which is really cool. So you can have it randomly blink. And of course, we can go into the operator stack, make sure we select our neon text here. And we can play with the frequency of this effect, right? So come down here, let's just go with frequency. Let's set it to 5. And as you can see, I've got blinking text that is not blinking together, but is blinking per character. Let's look at another example of that. So here I've got some text, and I'm going to add in a wiggle animator to it. And I want to show you, if I were to right click and I were to choose wiggle and then just choose location and let go, then it's just kind of moving around. But that's not what I want to do. Again, I want to just click and I want to choose wiggle, and then I want to choose text character location. And we'll let go. And you can see that that is looking pretty good. And if we wanted to have this animate over time so that it was crazy and moving around a lot, and then it kind of comes to a head and sort of stops animating and straightens out, what we can do is we can scroll down in here into the animator settings here, and you'll see that time source right now is set to world time. If I set this to sequence, right, and then I set the sequence name to be the AVA sequence, that is the default sequence that comes here, right, we use that, and now it's gonna animate only when the sequencer is playing. And also, it's no longer random. I mean, it is random, but it's randomly starting at this frame where it's always going to be the same. So if you had to do a repeat, maybe you needed to re-render and you want it to look the same, when you're using the sequencer for this stuff, then it becomes locked to the time. You can, of course, play with the different seeds that are right here. So you can play with the seed. I can change this to 6, and that will give me a different look. But the point is that it's all still locked to the timeline. Now, how do I make it stop animating over time? So why don't we go to the global magnitude up here, and I'll just lock it in at 1 right there, and I'll come down a little further, and then I'll move that to 0. Actually, I'm going to come here in the timeline and set that to 0. And now if we play it back, it settles in. So you can stretch that out if you want. There we go. And you can also set this up much higher. Like I said, if you wanted to be really crazy, something like, let's set it to 5. That should be going pretty nuts. Right, so start here. And there you go. Jumping back to this little project, let's take a look at the Bounce Animator. That one's a little harder to work with, but let's see what we can do with it. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to choose Bounce, and I'm going to choose Location, and then I'm just going to go over here to my relative location to turn all these off. I don't need anything except for Z, and we can't see it's going through the floor. So if I twirl this down, I can see that it's the amplitude minimum is negative 100. So I'm going to set it to 0, so it lands right at that start point there. And then if I wanted to have it stop looping, that's a little more complicated. What we've got to do is come down further into here, and let's change it from time source of world to sequence. All right, come down here again, and then sequence name will change to AVA sequence. And what we can do is we can actually choose, well, first of all, we can just see that it's happening over and over again now only based on the sequencer. But we can use a start time. I can say, hey, let's start it at the 1 second mark and a stop time of 2. Now, because we're using a frequency of 1, which just happens to be a second, this works out pretty well. We just have to make sure that we go, so at the 1 second mark, it's going to fall, and it's going to bounce, and it's going to hold. Honestly, if we're talking about just the Bounce Animator, I feel like it's pretty janky. There's definitely some work to be done on this, but I have a lot of faith in the team. We've been in touch and been on the beta, and you can see they're working so hard, and they just keep adding cool stuff to it. So I have a lot of faith about that. The last animator I'm going to look at is going to be the Soundwave Animator. And if I take a look, I've got a Soundwave in here. I brought in some music, dropped it into Unreal, and then I'm going to go over to the sequencer, and I'm going to choose plus to add in an audio track. And then I'm just going to hit plus for the audio, and this is the audio that's here. Just double click to bring that in. And I was noticing it started in frame 19, so I'm just going to bring it back to frame 0 and bring that over there. Okay, and then I'm going to select my sphere. And for animator, I'm just going to right click, I'm going to choose Soundwave, and I'm going to choose Scale. And then over here, I'm going to choose the same audio right there. And we can see that it's bouncing. Now, I want it to match with the audio that's going to be in the sequencer, so I'm just going to move down over to here, go from world to sequence, and then I'm going to choose the AVA sequence, and let's take a look and see what happens. Yeah, all right, well, that's how that works. As you can see, there's a lot of cool stuff in Unreal Engine 5.4. They are pushing hard into the motion design space, and it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. Anyway, as always, I hope that this helps you in your work. If you want to learn Unreal Engine from the ground up, I strongly recommend you take our course, Unreal Engine for 3D Artists with Jonathan Winbush. Hey, I took it and it got me started, so check it out. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Aharon Rabinowitz for School of Motion. I'll see you in the next one.